I imagine that there are two camps that view Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice in different ways. The first camp criticizes this game based on its merits as a traditional video game, and the second camp praises it for approaching mental illness in a much more serious way than most other games that approach this topic. My reaction lies somewhere between the endpoints on this continuum. I do see its faults as a traditional game, and they do detract from the experience Hellblade is trying to evoke, but I also empathize with the praise people lay on this game as an important one for the industry. On both fronts, however, Hellblade is not completely successful, far from it in fact. It tries to marry a core system and a superficial layer that doesn't interact with it, which ends up making this game feel like a woman with no butt. It doesn't twerk. Well, at least as well as it feasibly could. But that doesn't mean I think it's an outright awful or unsuccessful game. I'll be deeply analyzing Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, so I suggest playing the game before watching. Mechanically, Hellblade is a third-person puzzle game with shallow combat elements. Experientially, it's a psychosis simulator, or rather a simulation of knowing someone with psychosis. One of the major blunders and transgressions of this game as a whole is that the two don't work together. It's a blunder because it fails to take advantage of how these two components can coexist in an interactive medium, and it's a transgression because it actively disservices the game and prevents it from not seizing all of the potential opportunities it has. In other words, there's very little, if any, communication between them. To use an everyday experience as an example, it's like eating the burned crust atop a fresh creme brulee. The creme comprises most of the dessert, but there still lies a thin layer of something different on the top. That is where the insertion of psychosis resides. Its inclusion is simply a surface treatment. Important, relevant, and meaningful it might be, but still a surface treatment. Staining wood isn't going to change the underlying material to steel, but only slightly discolor it in a way that pleases the eyes of many humans. Nothing changes how players interact with the mechanics by dint of the narrative. People have described playing this game as the most magnificent experience they've had playing a game, and while I can't discredit or deny their experience, it seems like they're drinking their own Kool-Aid and fooling themselves into liking it more than they otherwise would just because the game is different. One possible explanation is that Ninja Theory made concessions to make the topic of mental illness accessible rather than making it nuanced, causing people to think the game is any deeper than it is. Let's try a thought experiment. Imagine Hellblade as a movie. Remove every moment that could be mistaken for player interaction, like the combat. Next, imagine the moments where Senua is walking through the illusion doorways or searching for shapes in the environment slightly more cinematic, however you want to interpret that word. How does your knowledge of Senua's suffering change? How does the experience of your relationship with her change? Please take a moment of silence to genuinely digest the possible changes and massage this experiment in your mind. I'll bargain that very little changes, and what this comes down to is player agency. Agency is what makes video games unique as a medium, and it's why different characters from different games are cared about in different amounts. For example, very little is known about Wander and his horse Agro in Shadow of the Colossus, but when Agro falls from the cliff, it's a hard-hitting moment. There aren't numerous cutscenes of the two interacting, and Wander barely says a word throughout the entire game. So why is this moment as potent as it is? Any character development on Wander or Agro is done mostly in the mind of the player. Traveling from one Colossus to the next grants a reprieve from the action, such that the player can think about the events thus far. The player also relies on the horse an extraordinary amount for transportation. It's important that controlling Agro is more like controlling Wander, who is riding Agro, rather than controlling the horse directly. It contributes to her feeling like a different creature entirely, as opposed to her being an extension of Wander. He sometimes needs his horse to defeat a Colossus, but not always, further solidifying her independence. I could go on, but these details make the effects of her plummet on the player that much more compelling. Agency is a common denominator here, and similar things cannot be said about the player's agency in Senua's story. You rely upon and control Agro. You do not influence Senua's hallucinations. They would act as they do with or without your input. You made concerted efforts to drive the sword into the Colossus' head. You followed Hellblade's directions to press a button when it tells you to. Every Colossus you kill changes the state of the world. Senua's mental state nor the world in which he operates seems to care if you killed 100 of its beasts. Investing the player in any universe is as simple as implementing a strong sense of agency, or the idea that the player's actions clearly alter the world in some way. Although simple is an understated word in that sentence, it doesn't nullify any game's necessity for agency to draw the player into its world. This problem is twofold because not only do your actions fail to influence her mental state, but her mental state doesn't change. Allow me to correct that statement. Her mental state does change, but only at the convenience of gameplay. Darkness and shadows are a non-element for the large majority of the game, but when there's an opportunity for a system that invokes dark versus light spaces, then the darkness becomes relevant. No hints or foreshadows to this were ever present prior to its inclusion. A narration coming from a voice in her head tells us that this fear was born from her time alone and abandoned as a child. So why do we see this manifestation for only an hour? Don't get me wrong, I'm satisfied with the inclusion of this type of gameplay because it's interesting enough, but it's wasted potential that it had no bearing on any other part of the game and didn't affect my relationship with Senua or her psychosis. Hellblade continuously presents to the player the voices in Senua's mind breeding conflict, simultaneously telling her to do and not to do things. This conflict happens so frequently that it's obvious the player is supposed to be aware of it, but it never translates to gameplay. Not once do we doubt ourselves or have conflicting emotions about our actions in the game, although it seems like we're supposed to because of the portrayal of Senua's condition. Pervading the veins of every potentially treacherous situation is the total lack of treacherousness. Walking across a narrow beam with the threat of a long fall is neither threatening nor investing if all you're doing is holding forward on the controller. But Hellblade seems to think that it is because it uses this tactic frequently. I didn't even know it was possible to fall until they pulled this a few times because losing balance is difficult and I didn't once actually fall. This loops back to the significance of agency. Yes, I do play a role in whether or not she makes it across this thin ledge, but that role means nothing. Holding my joystick to the side with my eyes closed would accomplish the same thing, so how can this be a meaningful situation? How does slightly changing the direction of the joystick on my controller change my relationship with Senua or my engagement in the gameplay? How does it influence any feelings I may have one way or another regarding psychosis? You might criticize me for nitpicking on this small detail and hastily generalizing the entire game because of it, but it's representative of everything you do in the game. Walking across narrow ledges and beams are pointless because they don't offer a different experience, whether it be audio-visual or through the mechanics of the game. If it doesn't offer a new experience in any form, then there isn't much of a point for it to be in there. It wouldn't be much of an issue if not for their sheer opulence. It's worth mentioning that if the developers didn't think they added something meaningful to the game, the beams and ledges wouldn't be there. Before I discuss the puzzle systems, I will go over the combat. Dark Souls immediately entered my mind when I first engaged in Hellblade's combat. Similarities are rife between the two, but there's one aspect that makes the combat of Dark Souls more engaging, and that's enemy diversity. Both games have the following moves available: light attack, heavy attack, block, parry and riposte, dodge and roll, backstep, and healing items. Why Hellblade's combat is boring and quickly evolves into a chore is because all enemies are defeated with identical means. Parry and attack, barrage them until they attack again, dodge, attack them until they turn to you, parry and attack, rinse, and repeat. More specifically than general strategy, all enemies except one are bipedal hominoids with a weapon of some sort. I would think that a tribal woman experiencing abominable hallucinations would encounter much more variety, considering humans at that time had many more irrational fears. In Dark Souls, however, although there are many bipedal hominoids, each enemy has a different moveset that must be approached differently. Retorting that keeping Hellblade simple is important to its experience as a reasoning for shallow combat, as I speculate some will say, isn't totally valid, because if I'm getting bored by a game and almost mindlessly pressing buttons gets me through it, I can't see a point that would excuse the shallowness. Even coming up with a justification for the combat being boring doesn't mean it should be in the game. If you wanted to interpret this boredom as a representation to the player of the incessant and routine visitations of Senua's hallucinations and hardships, it still doesn't hold up because that assumes that boring combat is the only way to achieve that meaning. In its current abundance, the combat doesn't contribute to the meaning of the game. Homogeneity in enemies detriments the narrative and the gameplay despite better alternatives. What if the enemies were used tactically? There are some segments in the latter half of the game where you must avoid the dark, else Senua dies from being overwhelmed by the hallucinations. So, enemies would present a trade-off in this circumstance, and their offhand is a torch that illuminates what would otherwise be darkness, but killing them lengthens the amount of time you can be in the darkness without dying. Now, there is an incentive to take one action over another, injecting a meaningful decision into simply avoiding the dark. It's not much of an issue ever anyway, because every moment is scripted to last just the right amount of time to reach an illuminated destination, also supporting my statement earlier about your actions as a player not bearing weight in this universe. Puzzle systems are also shallow, but I do excuse them barring one exception. All of the different types of puzzles, if they can be called that, are the following. Environmental shape finding, a lot of environmental shape finding, assembling shards in perspective, and illusion doorways. Accepting a gimmick or two based off these systems, these mere three occupy the entire front of puzzling, which, like the combat, become fatiguing quicker than it should have. Fatiguing they may be, but that's not to say I didn't enjoy them as I was doing them. On most occasions, the local environments were both aesthetically and graphically interesting enough to sustain my focus and engrossment. That is why I excuse them despite their triviality and lack of depth. It's not often that I make pardons based on visuals, but this is one of those times. The exception I mentioned earlier is the distance between mentally solving the puzzle and physically completing it. Frequently, I solved a puzzle early on, but still needed to move to where I needed to be to satisfy it. For example, standing at this point, I knew I needed to go to a vantage directly above me, but the game required me to slowly make my way there and slog through pointlessly existent enemies to do so. Completing puzzles feels the most satisfying when the amount of effort and time it takes to physically manifest the results of the puzzle are proportionally short to the amount of effort and time it took to mentally solve it. Senua's walking speed isn't intrinsically in fault here because I truly don't mind it, although I suspect many other players did. The true fault is the level design. Sudoku was fun because the difficulty and time it takes to physically write the numbers in after solving for them is minuscule. But when the solution is quickly determined and the execution time is large, that's when puzzle solving veers more towards a hassle than an intellectual reward. This is where Hellblade dwells, and everything about it suffers from this approach. Bluffing that the rot was going to function, well, at all like it said it would, immensely disappointed me. Its exclusion is bad for two reasons. First, implementing this rule would have matched the concept of this game perfectly, symbolizing that Senua's mental perspicacity and strength has been utterly compromised past the point of no return. Secondly, it would have announced to the public, both players and developers, that highly recognized games can and should risk scrutiny for the sake of their artistic vision. Additionally, the game's not terribly difficult, so this would have been a tangible but uncommon punishment for carelessness. Illustrating the rot reaching her head in the ending moments was the only payoff for its inclusion, and a poor payoff it was. The deeper meaning of it all really did sell how disturbing this game is. There was obviously no medical technology or knowledge in her time to diagnose her condition, let alone treat it. As I think more profoundly about this, I lament her situation more. Her experiences are so powerful to her own perspective, yet she has no idea why they're happening, or why specifically to her. I imagine trying to explain this to anyone in a time where the simple concept of mental disorder was not just foreign, but completely incomprehensible. It would be like you trying to understand that the sun is 150 million kilometers away. Humans cannot comprehend such a number or distance. We've evolved to easily understand a few kilometers because that's all we had to worry about as proto-humans. In the current year, those suffering from psychosis likely have the support of their parents, medical treatments, and small communities of people that suffer from similar affects. But even with all this, individuals still feel isolated in their affliction. Removing every spindle of support, even your family being there, destroys any semblance of stability or convenience in life. What's actually there, like family, is against you, and so are the hallucinations. Neither truce nor pardon are present to dull the edges of all the threats around you. Most vital to my relationship with Senua was the actress's performance, which was very successful. Two features contributed to its success in majority. The first was that I never felt the game used psychosis as a hand wave to do whatever they want, similar to how the "it was all a dream" excuses things. Secondly is from the delivery and conviction of her lines. Resting between each of her sentences was the anticipation of the next, because the tension that the last word of one sentence left, the following picked up. The total absence of psychological fortitude one must have to carry a skull with them in an attempt to revive the person that the skull once belonged to is astonishing. Mind you, this isn't a fleeting moment of poor judgment. It's an entire journey and tribulation brought unto herself for this hollow aspiration. We can hate her father for being abusive towards her, but we can't hate him for his ignorance, especially considering he knew that some boy wasn't going to help cure her. She has no faith that the gods can help. Her trust lies solely in the thoughts which harm her the most. She perceives her illusion as the most righteous thing to pursue, yet we can see her fault in this pursuit. However, this is a reflection of our own lives. Just as you see her not being the conscious author of her own thoughts, the same is the case with you. You didn't pick the country you were born in, the color of your skin, the genes that dictate your health, or the environment you were raised in. You didn't even pick what species you were. But you ultimately feel like you have your own free will, despite your will being just as free as Senua's. The reason her brain activity is considered a disorder is because it's highly uncommon among humans and that she can't control them. But what makes you think you can control your thoughts? If you can't think a thought before you think it, how do you author your own thoughts? Neuroscientist and philosopher Sam Harris echoes these thoughts and offers this small experiment.
Let's run a little experiment. Think of a city, anywhere in the world. You can choose any city you want. And now, of course, I could have primed you. I could have artfully placed cues in my speech in the last few minutes that would make you more likely to think of Las Vegas, for instance. So, just to be on the safe side, don't pick Vegas. But pick a city, any city, and just pay attention to what this conscious process is like. Now, the first thing to notice about this is as free a decision as you are ever going to make in your life. Okay, you have all the cities in the world to choose from, and I'm just asking you to pick one. Now, several cities have probably occurred to you, and just focus on one. So everybody got a city? All right, well, I'm sorry to say that you all picked the wrong city. Don't ask me how I know this, but I do. So I just want you to do this again, just so you can see what the process is like. Pick another city. Can't be the first. And notice what that experience is like. Okay. Did you see any evidence for free will? Now, we better be able to find it here. I mean, if it's not here, it's not anywhere. So let's look for it. First, let's set aside all those cities whose names you don't know and therefore could not have picked. Okay, because you couldn't have picked one of those if your life depended on it. There's no freedom in that, obviously. Okay, and then there are many other cities whose names are quite well known to you, but which simply didn't occur to you to pick. I mean, for instance, perhaps Cairo, didn't occur to you. You absolutely know that Cairo is a city, but for whatever reason, your Cairo circuits were not engaged. Okay, as a matter of neurophysiology, Cairo was not in the cards. So I want you to think about this. Were you free to choose that which did not occur to you to choose?
We view people with tumors as merely victims of biology and excuse their actions as those not of their own volition. But the actions executed as results of tumors are no different than the actions executed by anyone you would consider normal. I hope that other players don't simply play through this game and set it down just as quickly, because there's something to be learned about here regarding the inner lives of those on the outside. Next time you're sitting on the bus or train or driving home on the highway, remember that every single one of those people has a backstory and lore just as complex as yours. This is one large lump of content to think over, but the question from earlier returns. Could this effect have been achieved only as a video game? The answer is no, because I had realizations like this long before this game released, but that doesn't validate its meaning to the people whom haven't had these thoughts that probe at the life of the minds outside their own. And I hope that I offered those realizations to those who haven't. You might say that it doesn't matter if games are the only medium that this message could have been achieved through, but I combat that by saying not taking advantage of the unique qualities of the medium is a squander of the highest degree. The whole of Hellblade is greater than its parts. I know everything I've said so far seems overwhelmingly negative, but I didn't hate the game. I wasn't perpetually enthralled by it, but I also wasn't constantly bored by it. Fatigue set in for me a couple hours from the end of the game due to repetitiveness, but it is nonetheless an important piece of work for the industry and one I recommend playing. Not because it is unique in its attempts at serious topics, Oddworld Abe's Odyssey does this, which released in 1997, but because it partially entered the mainstream of gaming. Although I don't think Hellblade is the shining pinnacle of insightful games, it does what I want games to do, challenge the mind of those playing them. Games force us to internalize systems in a way other media do not, and this can be very powerful. I went to an art museum yesterday and analyzed and interpreted various objects of art with friends I was with. If I told that to any person on the street, they would likely say, "So what?" But if I told them I wrote thousands of words analyzing and interpreting a video game, I would get far from the same response, because many people don't see games as a fruitful or even existent engagement of intellect, philosophy, or creativity. Just as all art should elicit a thoughtful reaction of some variety, so should games, and Hellblade is just one buoy that helps guide us one step further to the other side of the ocean.